The factory passed every safety inspection. Then investigators found a report that was never supposed to leave the building. Inside was a warning nobody acted on. The factory was considered a success story. Located on the edge of a growing industrial city, it employed thousands of workers and supplied products across the country. Executives praised its efficiency. Local officials praised its economic impact. Safety inspectors praised its compliance record. On paper, everything looked excellent. The factory passed inspections. The factory met regulations. The factory expanded year after year. But years later, investigators discovered a report hidden deep inside company archives. The document had been written months before a major incident. It described safety concerns that had never been fully resolved. Concerns involving equipment, procedures, and emergency systems. The report was reviewed. The report was filed. And then the factory continued operating as if the warning had never existed. The author of the report was not an outsider. He worked inside the facility. For more than 15 years, he had overseen safety audits, maintenance reviews, and operational inspections. Colleagues described him as cautious and highly respected. He was not known for creating unnecessary problems. That is why his report immediately attracted attention. Inside the document, he identified several areas requiring urgent review: emergency shutoff systems, maintenance delays, equipment operating beyond recommended service limits. None of the issues guaranteed disaster, but together they created risk. His recommendation was simple: conduct a full safety review before production increases any further. The recommendation was submitted. Management acknowledged receiving it, and production continued without interruption. Years later, investigators tried to determine what happened to the report. At first, they assumed it had simply been archived. Large industrial facilities generate enormous amounts of paperwork: inspection records, maintenance logs, safety audits, equipment certifications. Documents disappear all the time. But something about this case felt different. References to the report appeared throughout internal correspondence. Emails mentioned it. Meeting notes discussed it. Managers referenced it during planning sessions. Yet the report itself could not be found. Investigators discovered copies of discussions about the report, copies of summaries, copies of responses, but not the original document. It was as if somebody had removed the report while leaving behind evidence that it once existed. And that raised an uncomfortable question. Was the report lost, or was it hidden? The factory continued operating for years without major incidents. That made the missing report easy to forget. Every month production targets were met. Every quarter profits increased. New contracts arrived. Additional shifts were added. The longer nothing happened, the easier it became to believe the concerns had been exaggerated. But hidden inside maintenance records, investigators found a different story. Equipment failures became more frequent. Temporary repairs became more common. Safety systems required repeated servicing. Individually, none of the problems appeared alarming. Together they formed a pattern investigators would later recognize immediately. The factory was not suddenly becoming unsafe. The warning signs had been accumulating for years. Most people simply never saw them connected together. The first serious warning did not come from management. It came from the machines. Monitoring systems began recording unusual operating conditions. Temperatures fluctuated. Pressure readings occasionally exceeded expectations. Automatic shutdown systems activated more often than engineers considered normal. Maintenance teams documented everything. Reports were submitted. Additional inspections were requested. Some recommendations were approved. Others were postponed. The official explanation was simple: the factory was expanding. Higher production naturally created more stress on equipment. But years later, investigators reviewing the records noticed something troubling. Several of the affected systems had already been mentioned in the missing safety report. The same equipment, the same concerns, the same unanswered questions, and the factory appeared to be repeating a warning it had already ignored. Several months before the incident, the former maintenance supervisor sent a letter to the company's internal safety office. He described problems that, according to him, were being treated as routine, when they were not routine at all. Delayed repairs, overworked equipment, emergency systems tested on paper but rarely under real conditions. He warned that the factory was relying on temporary fixes instead of solving the underlying problem. The letter was received. A meeting was scheduled. Then the trail went quiet. Investigators later searched for the results of that meeting. They found no final memo, no full review, no evidence that production was slowed. The warning had entered the system. Then, like the earlier report, it disappeared inside it. The pressure inside the factory kept growing. Not just mechanical pressure, business pressure. New contracts required higher output. Managers pushed for longer shifts. Production targets increased. Maintenance windows became shorter. Machines that were supposed to rest between cycles were kept running longer than recommended. Officially, the facility remained compliant. But workers noticed changes. More alarms, more heat, more emergency stops, more repairs that were meant to last weeks but failed after days. Each issue was explained away. A sensor problem, a worn part, a busy season. But years later, investigators would see the pattern clearly. The factory had been warning everyone. The problem was that the warnings were easier to explain than to confront. Then came the review that should have changed everything. A new safety team compared years of maintenance records, equipment logs and internal warnings. Their conclusion was serious. Several systems were operating too close to failure limits. The team recommended a full shutdown for deeper inspection, not a small repair, not another temporary fix, a shutdown. The recommendation moved through several departments: operations, finance, management, legal. Everyone understood what a shutdown meant. Lost contracts, delayed shipments, public questions. So the language began to change. A shutdown became a review became monitoring, monitoring became continued operation. By the time the final summary was approved, the urgency had almost disappeared. The day of the incident began like every other production day. Workers arrived before sunrise. Machines started on schedule. Supervisors reviewed output targets. Nothing appeared unusual from the outside. Then, shortly after the morning shift began, alarms activated in one section of the facility. At first, workers believed it was another false warning. They had seen alarms before. They had seen resets before. They had watched the system return to normal many times. But this time, the readings did not stabilize. Temperatures continued rising. Pressure readings moved beyond expected levels. Emergency procedures began. The factory floor was cleared from the affected area. And within minutes, the situation became much more serious than anyone expected. The investigation began almost immediately. Inspectors entered the facility after the area was secured. Engineers reviewed damaged equipment. Company records were collected. Maintenance logs were copied. Safety reports were requested. At first, attention focused on the machine involved in the incident. Which component failed? Which system reacted too late? Which alarm sounded first? But the more records investigators reviewed, the more the case changed. The incident was not just about one machine. It was about years of warnings. Reports had existed. Requests had existed. Maintenance concerns had existed. And again, the most serious questions had been delayed, softened or buried. The investigation was no longer about equipment. It was about decisions. Months into the investigation, a records specialist made an unexpected discovery. Inside an unused archive room sat dozens of storage boxes from earlier factory audits. Most contained routine paperwork, equipment manuals, inspection schedules, training records. But one box carried a classification code linked directly to the factory safety department. Inside were internal memos, draft reports and archived correspondence, and among them sat the document investigators had spent months searching for. The original factory safety report. Not a copy, not a summary. The original report. The pages showed signs of age but remained readable, and what they revealed changed the entire direction of the case. Several recommendations had never appeared in the official records. Entire sections were missing. Warnings had been reduced. Risks had been minimized. For the first time, investigators could compare the original report to the version management had approved. When investigators placed the two reports side by side, the differences were impossible to ignore. The original version described unresolved safety concerns. The approved version described manageable operational issues. Entire paragraphs had disappeared. Technical conclusions had been rewritten. Critical recommendations were missing. The language had changed. The meaning had changed, and those changes affected how later decisions were made. No one could determine exactly when the edits occurred, but somebody had altered the report before it reached final decision makers. The discovery transformed the investigation. This was no longer just a factory incident. It was an information case. Who changed the report? Who approved the edits? And who benefited from keeping production moving instead of addressing the concerns? The investigation never identified a single person responsible, at least not officially. Instead, evidence pointed toward a chain of decisions spread across multiple departments. One recommendation was softened. One review was delayed. One repair was postponed. One concern was downgraded. Each decision appeared reasonable when viewed alone. Together, they created risk. Investigators concluded that the incident was not caused by one mistake. It was caused by accumulation, small compromises, small delays, small assumptions. Over time, Those decisions built upon one another until the original warning became almost invisible. The factory had not failed because nobody knew about the risk. The factory failed because too many people knew about pieces of it. After years of analysis, interviews and document reviews, investigators reached their conclusion. The incident was not the result of one machine failure. The machine merely exposed problems that already existed. The risks had been identified, documented, reported, and repeatedly underestimated. The buried report did not predict every detail of what happened, but it identified the same systems investigators later focused on. The recommendations were reasonable, the requests for additional review were justified, and earlier action could have reduced the risks significantly, perhaps not prevented every problem, but changed the outcome. For investigators, that became the central lesson of the case. The warning had existed all along. Today, the original safety report remains one of the most important documents connected to the case, not because it predicted the future, not because it contained a shocking secret, but because it proved something investigators already suspected. The warning existed, the evidence existed, the questions existed. Long before the incident, the report survived, the archive survived, the signatures survived, and together they revealed a truth more disturbing than any conspiracy. Most industrial disasters do not begin with a failure. They begin with a warning that seems manageable, a warning that can wait until next month, a warning someone assumes another department will handle. And years later, investigators open a forgotten file and discover the disaster did not begin on the day something went wrong. It began on the day someone chose not to listen. Case file closed.